would be referred to as a system of record because it has to be maintained in its integrity. What was no longer valid due to the recounts.
When you say it was no longer valid, what do you mean?
The ballots had been, they'd been retabulated for the recounts, thus Maricopa County was unable to map those back.
And were some of the ballots that you inspected duplicated ballots?
Yes, sir, they were.
And what are duplicated ballots?
Duplicated ballots are when there's an issue with the ballot and it cannot be ran through the tabulation system. Therefore, it is duplicated, and then that duplication is run through the system.
And is that duplication then the ballot that is actually tabulated and counted?
Yes, sir. The way the process works is the original ballot has to have the duplication ID attached to it, which Maricopa did. The part where they filled in the statute is according to the standards, that duplication ballot is supposed to be easily relatable to the original ballot. They said they could not find let me correct that. They could not find the duplicated ballot which was tabulated.
So you inspected the original ballot that was duplicated?
Yes, sir.
And do I understand correctly that under your understanding of Arizona law is that the duplicate ballot and the original ballot are supposed to be maintained together physically?
Yes, sir. That's an EAC requirement. That's a standard when duplication is done.
And the duplicate ballot, which is the ballot that was counted,
yes, sir,
was not available for you to inspect because of that?
No, sir, it was not.
Why would there be? Could you tell me again why there might be a duplicated ballot situation?
It would be because it was physically damaged. I did see torn ballots. They could have coffee stains on them. They could have ink marks, or they could just be improperly configured.
How long did you take to conduct your inspection?
We were there all day, except for a 45-minute lunch break. It took the morning because of not being able to track the selected ballots that I wanted to look at. We worked together and found the samplings, and that took all morning to get that sorted out.
And did you take notes contemporaneously with your inspection?
Yes, sir.
Approximately how many ballots did you inspect?
There were 348 that were set aside, and then there were approximately 25 because we did not finish because of the time restraint.
And out of that 348 that were set aside, how many were ballots printed from a ballot-on-demand printer?
In what I analyzed between the 6 vote centers, I specifically, and then there was the spoiled ballots that could be examined. I requested that the spoiled ballots be from those same vote centers. This allows me a more accurate response to be able to look at a spoiled ballot and see it's just the same ballot ID and the same actual ballot style as another ballot within that same voting center. The one thing that I have to point out is out of all the spoiled ballots and the duplicated original ballots, there were a total of 113 ballots examined. 48 of those existed because there was a 19-inch image of a ballot printed on 20-inch paper.
Objection, Your Honor. Move to strike as non-responsive. I'm not sure what question he was answering.
Well, I don't know that it was non-responsive. I'll overrule it cross-examine.
So, Mr. Parikh, it's your testimony upon inspection of these ballots that you determined that there was a 19-inch ballot image projected onto the 20-inch paper. Is that accurate?
Yes, that is accurate. That's one of the initial things when I initially were reviewing evidence that was presented and in the public. I saw that the ballots, and it was, to me, was easily identifiable.
And is this something that going into this inspection you had seen evidence of?
Yes, sir.
And what evidence was that?
That was a photograph of a spoiled ballot right next to the reprinted ballot from a vote center, and that's included in my declaration.
When you say that's included, do you mean the photographs?
Yes, sir.
And so when you were inspecting the ballots yesterday and you determined that the duplicated ballots and the spoiled ballots, we'll strike that. How many duplicated ballots did you inspect?
15 total.
And out of that, and duplicated again means that the ballot was not, was rejected by the tabulator for some reason?
Yes, sir. It could not be tabulated at either the ICP2s, which are at the vote center, or the ICC at MTEC.
Out of that 15, how many of those contained a 19-inch ballot image on 20-inch paper?
14.
14. What about the other remaining?
It was physically defective.
And when you say
it was
physically,
slightly torn.
can you explain to the court how a 19-inch ballot image, we'll strike that. How did you determine that it was a 19-inch ballot image projected onto 20-inch paper?
Because these ballot images are a PDF file which gets stored along with configuration settings. That's what makes up the ballot style and the ballot definition, which is created usually on the EMS, which the actual application that does the ballot style is called EED, right? That's the application that actually does the ballot style. It's usually installed on the EMS server. That application creates that style, the definition, because it needs those things because it gets loaded on the tabulator. That's how it's evaluated when the image is created. And that's the print job, to use a common term, that gets sent to the printer.
And how could, how did you determine that it was actually a 19-inch image projected onto a 20-inch paper?
I can determine that 100% of all the ballots are rejected because the mechanics of a printer, the feeds are not always accurate. On the 20-inch ballots, you can see the same, I refer to them as tick marks, but they're actually the borders of the image that is sent. And on the 20-inch ballots, you'll see about the very corner above the borders where there's any misfeed. On the 19-inch ballots, they were well viewable in the margins. There are 90-degree right angles at each corner of the page and the image.
Did you physically measure the ballots to determine that?
Yes, sir, I did. I requested a ruler, and Maricopa graciously got me one, and they got one of the other inspectors a ruler.
How could a 19-inch ballot image appear? We'll strike that. You've heard previous testimony. Were you here for Mr. Jarrett's testimony?
Yes, sir, I was.
And did you hear Mr. Jarrett testify that in the November 2022 general election, a 20-inch ballot was used?
Yes, sir, I did.
And did you hear Mr. Jarrett testify that it would be a failure of the system if a 19-inch ballot image was projected onto a 20-inch paper?
Objection, Your Honor, that misstates the testimony of the prior witness as to the word failure.
I'm assuming you're going to follow up with a question for an opinion. I think you can frame it as a hypothetical without arguing about
Yes, Your Honor.
basis. Go ahead, rephrase.
In an election which is purportedly designed to take place with a 20-inch ballot image on 20-inch paper, how could a 19-inch ballot image appear?
Objection, call for speculation.
Let's ask a question first, yes or no, if you can tell. Ask him if you can tell, and then the objection, you can re-ask the question.
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Parikh, given your experience in training, particularly with electronic voting systems at 9 years, can you tell what the cause of a 19-inch ballot image being projected on 20-inch paper would be?
Yes, I can. I can give you both the technical ways that it could happen. There are only two ways that it can happen.
Can you tell the court the two ways that can happen?
One way is by changing the printer adjustments. That would make the printer adjustments and settings override the image file that was set. The other is from the application side or the operating system side. This is the same for anybody who ever prints anything at home. Your Microsoft Word can send the settings, or it can say to use the default settings of the printers. The application doing it, in this case, as it's a ballot, would have to be that there was a 19-inch image ballot definition.
And where does that definition reside?
That can vary depending on the system, but from what I heard in the testimony, it resides on the laptop that's connected to the printer, which I've seen it referred to as a control printer, but this is actually what would be called a print spooler, and it controls the print jobs to allow the printer to take on the load. And as there were multiple site books, this would be the technical use that laptop should be used for.
Is there any way, in your opinion, for a 19-inch ballot image to be projected on a 20-inch ballot by accident?
No, sir.
Why not?
Because the settings and the configurations and the procedures that are used cannot allow that. These are not a bump up against the printer and the settings change. There are security configurations. I've reviewed the evidence, and the printers are configured via script, which by any large organization that has to do multiple systems is a standard. This takes away the human error of somebody miscoding in the instructions either on the printer.
Prior to an election, would the strike that. Prior to an election, would it be detectable that a 19-inch ballot image had been projected onto 20-inch paper?
Yes, if logic and accuracy tested that all voting styles or ballot definitions were included, which a standard logic and accuracy testing should test every style that's available, and there should be a listing of such styles.
You perform testing for EAC certification, correct?
Yes, sir, I have.
Is it permissible to have two different ballot definitions in the same election with respect to the size of the ballot image?
No, sir. For example, if you live in an apartment building and your neighbor and you have the same school board district, you have the same precinct, all the jurisdictions for whether it's local, county, state, or federal are basically the same, that ballot style definition, the ID for it, should be singular. If you do not, then you have two different styles, you're assessing them differently. That can also produce forgery. There's only supposed to be one ballot style per those voting options, and that's what controls it.
The 19-inch ballot image that you observed in your inspection on multiple ballots, including duplicated and spoiled ballots, correct?
Yes, sir.
What effect would a 19-inch ballot image projected on a 20-inch piece of paper used in the election in Maricopa for November 2022 have when it was placed into one of these vote center tabulators?
It would cause it to be rejected. According to Dominion's documentation, they performed somewhere for between 200 and 300 checks on the actual physical paper ballot that gets inserted into the system. They state, and this is according to Dominion, the vendor who created the application, that it can reject a ballot for any one of those. A 19-inch image being on 20-inch paper increases the margin. Once the timing marks are seen and they're evaluated, the actual physical printer that created the image is saying, by the application telling it, you're done, but there's a remaining inch of paper in there, so it would assume there's a paper jam. And to detect, I specifically asked, there were paper jams to where he opened up and there was no paper. So from a programming perspective, the machine would throw the paper jam error, but yet there would be no paper.
And you're referring to a tech. You say you spoke to a tech. Would that be Aaron Smith?
Yes, sir.
And what did Mr. Smith tell you? First of all, who is Aaron? What is your understanding of Mr. Smith's role during the November 2022 election?
I think he repeatedly followed all the procedures that he was instructed to follow. He put a good, solid effort forward to resolve the issues. It finally became to where the issue could not be resolved according to the procedures, and he actually had to request a replacement tabulator, which so happened to be misconfigured.
Do you know why Aaron wanted to testify today?
I think-
Objection, Your Honor, call for speculation, lack of foundation.
That's gonna call for speculation.
Withdraw the question. What would it take? You mentioned that there are only two possibilities for how a 19-inch image could be configured onto the system to be put on a 20-inch piece of paper, correct?
Yes. My assessment applies to anything that is printed. Not just the specifics of this, but to anything that's printed. These are the way the technology functions.
But you testified that there's only two ways that
Yes,
this
there are only
situation
two.
could arise.
There are only two.
Okay. What would it take for you to determine which of the two possibilities is what occurred?
Specifically, as I did yesterday, inspecting the ballots. There were some ballots that were spotty, but the spottiness was also of batches from the vote centers that were correctly tabulated. So that confused me. And the stuff that was mentioned about the fusers and the heating, because they first said it was a toner issue when it's not. It's a tray weight issue, which affects the heat of the fusers. The mechanical function of a fuser and heater, from what I observed from the spottiness, did not match what is a standard error or example that would be demonstrated. There were one or two occasions that were exactly that way, but that was about 2 ballots out of all that I examined.
But if you were to try to determine whether it was a printer issue, configuration issue, or an issue with the ballot definition with respect to how a 19-inch image was projected onto 20-inch paper, what would you need to do?
I would need to see the ballot styles and the ballot definitions. In totality, if there's 50,000 of them, all of them should be examined.
Do you have, obviously you've been practicing in the cyber field for 2 decades, correct?
Yes, sir. And it includes everything, to include printers.
That's what I was going to ask you. Do you work with printers? Do you understand how printers function and work? And at what level is your experience?
To a detailed level, to where I actually called one of the government agencies in the missile defense side to get highly upset because I understand the protocols that run. And it's not just printers, there are multifunctional devices, MFDs as we refer to them, because they can scan, they can print, they can send file transfers, and I've evaluated protocols. I've also done root cause analysis because classified printers they can print classified data even when they're not supposed to because of the rollers. And this is one thing I refer to it as ghost printing. I did see that repeatedly on the early vote ballots that were printed by Runtech because, in my opinion, the ink was a little bit too deep and too shiny for that, and I did. I was able to even see candidates' names in white space. It's very light and gray, but that's why I refer to it as ghost printing.
What would you recommend be done with the ballots currently stored at MTech now, given your findings from the inspection?
Objection to relevance, lack of foundation, speculation.
You need to rephrase the question. I'm going to sustain it.
Do you have any concerns regarding the security of the ballots, given your findings from your inspection yesterday that a 19-inch image was projected onto the samples from 6 different vote centers that you examined of 20-inch paper?
Yes, I can, and if it is okay with the court, I have to answer this in 2 ways. They both are pertinent, but first, I observed while ballots were being pulled out and sampled, and they obliged in every direction, whether top, middle, or that they were provided. I observed more improperly imaged ballots that were not inspected that were there. Now, to answer the question, those should be secured. I will state, in my capacity, I handle everything from physical security to accrediting buildings for classified information storage. I've been a classified courier, which means I'm authorized to transport classified information. As a forensic investigator, I fully understand chain of custody. And what I will cite is that the facility and the security and chain of custody at the vault and the tabulation center are highly inaccurate, and those ballots could be tampered with. They should be sealed in appropriate actions. For example, security seals were only placed on the boxes that we inspected, and that was due to the court order, and they wanted to ensure that the proper security was done.
Objection, Your Honor, I'm going to move to strike as non-responsive. I'm not sure, again, what question that was answering.
That was non-responsive to the questions beyond the scope, so, of what's before the court. So, strike the last part of his answer.
John, just a point of clarification. You said strike the last part.
His answer, he had 2 parts to his answer. He said first, he observed ballots properly, imaged ballots beyond what was sampled. That was part 1. Part 2 is the commentary about the continued or ongoing storage. It's all right, I've been accused of being soft-spoken. Part 2 was the testimony that related to the ongoing security concerns. That's the part that is not relevant to the issues that are before the court today.
That's right. Mr. Parikh, you mentioned that you saw other ballots that you could see, do I understand that correctly, had a 19-inch ballot image projected onto 20-inch paper?
Yes, sir.
And how could you tell that?
Because the difference in the margin, as they were being taken out of the box and placed on the table and shuffled around, it was obvious, it was apparent to me.
Is there, when on these ballots with a 19-inch image, are there marks that are different around the corners than the 20-inch ballots?
Yes, sir. You will see the corner edges of the image, which would be considered, the actual size of the paper. Those right angle marks at each, the top left, top right, bottom left, bottom right, are within the margin space. They're clearly visible.
Did you, you mentioned that you kept notes
Yes,
of your inspection. Did you draft a report that summarized those notes with conclusions?
Yes, sir, I did.
If the court were to ask you for it, would you be able to provide it to the court?
Yes, sir, I would.
And would that report be, would you swear to the accuracy of your conclusions in that report?
Yes, I would.
And would you swear to the accuracy of the results of your inspection in that report?
Yes, sir, I would.
You testified earlier that having a 19-inch ballot image projected on a 20-inch ballot, as you observed, appearing from ballots cast in 6 different vote centers.
Yes.
Duplicated ballots, spoiled ballots. That could only arise from, could it be by accident or is it?
No, sir. It could not be by accident. Those are configuration changes. They're at administrative level on the printer, or they're with a ballot and style or ballot definition file. And those are done on the EMS system, which has password security and everything else. You have to add, the EED application is actually the one that creates the ballot style. That's what's used. It's commonly put on the EMS server because that's like the centerpiece. And those 2 systems are controlled access.
You testified earlier that you have been involved in other assessments of failures relating to cyber-related issues, correct?
Yes, sir.
And that we call that a root cause analysis, correct?
Yes, sir. I was part of the working group that established what's called the IRA process, which is a risk analysis and assessment process for the Missile Defense Agency years ago. It's a standard risk analysis and assessment, and in order to do that, that's the basis of how you analyze threat, and then you also, that's why you conduct root cause analysis, because you have to be specific when you assess risk. Excuse me.
In the performance, in your experience, and you testified earlier that the federal government that had actually criminally prosecuted people based on your findings in a root cause analysis?
Yes, sir. And sometimes they ignored my analysis, but that's beyond.
Given your opinion that, given your opinion and your knowledge of how ballot definitions are configured and how printers work, does your finding of a 19-inch image, ballot image, placed on 20-inch paper, does that implicate violations of criminal law?
Wait, hold on before you answer that.
Objection, Your Honor. Calls for speculation, lack of foundation, and it calls for a legal conclusion.
It does call for a legal conclusion.
Your Honor, the witness has testified that.
I heard.
Yes, Your Honor. I'll sit down. Based on what you have determined on your physical examination of these ballots, your experience both in the industry as a certified forensic hacking investigator, your CISSP, your skills with, I believe you called it IRAP, is that?
It's IRA, that's the acronym that does it. There are different, and this is specifically for technical risk and assessment. This is one of the issues when I work for the voting system test labs to get all the vendors. I've dealt with over 7 of them to my memory, right? None of them performed it. The labs didn't perform it. I eventually convinced one lab to do this because this is vital to when you're doing system testing, let alone security system testing. And this applies not just to electronic voting systems. This is to all information systems, all technology. These are standard engineering principles.
Is there any way you could be wrong about a 19-inch image being placed on 20-inch paper?
No, sir. I give the technical options that are there. There are 2 ways that this can happen. And based on this system and the controls in place, this could not have been an accident. There are only 2 options. It would take further investigation further forensic examination for me to determine exactly which one it was.
Thank you, Mr. Curry.
Cross-exam. That'd be you, Mr. Libby?
Your Honor, I think we're going to break up the cross-examination if possible, one from the county and one from the governor-elect Hobbs as well. And if we could do the counties first, I think we might get to the other one after lunch.
Mr. Libby?
Thank you, Your Honor. I appreciate that, as some of these allegations go directly to the conduct of the election by my client, Maricopa County. Is it, Mr. Puri, is that correct pronunciation?
Yes, sir, it is.
And where do you reside, Mr. Puri?
I reside in Huntsville, Alabama.
And you traveled up to Maricopa County for this proceeding?
Yes, sir, I did.
And who paid for your travel?
The attorney fund.
The attorney fund? What's the attorney fund?
It's the legal fund. I believe it's for all the attorneys associated with this.
With this particular litigation?
Yes.
And did the attorney fund pay for lodging as well? For your lodging?
Yes. Lodging is always considered travel.
And are you being paid for your time?
Yes.
And what is the rate at which you're being paid for your time?
$250 an hour.
That's also coming from the attorney fund?
Yes.
Are you familiar with an event called Michael Lindell's Moment of Truth?
Yes. I spoke at the event.
You appeared and spoke at the event?
Yes, I did.
And where was that event held?
In Missouri.
In Missouri. And was your travel from Alabama to Missouri paid for by someone other than yourself?
Yes, sir.
And who paid for that?
That would, I would assume, would be Mike Lindell. All their travel was arranged. He asked me to speak at the event, and I spoke.
And that would be true for your time? Did you also get paid for your time there?
I did not charge for my time.
And your lodging?
That's considered travel that was provided to me.
And when you say Mr. Lindell, you're referring to the My Pillow guy?
Yes, sir.
And you are a cybersecurity professional?
Yes, sir, I am.
During your investigation of this election, did you detect any hacking involved in the 22 general election in Maricopa County?
No, sir.
I believe you testified that yesterday you were down at McTech performing the court-ordered inspection of the ballots. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, I was.
And you were asked to select batches of ballots?
Yes.
You were asked to identify them. Did you use a highlighter and highlight the boxes?
Yes, I did.
Did you observe the custodian of those ballots opening those boxes?
Yes. They opened them in front of all the inspectors. There was a court reporter inspected. There was the other inspector for the other side, that gentleman sitting over there who said he was an attorney. We all were there as they went through it.
Did the individual who opened the box break the seal?
By seal, are you referring to the red tape, which is simply red tape and not a security seal?
Well, I'm asking you what you observed.
I would not categorize what closed the boxes as a seal.
Did you see the serial numbers on it?
There were no serial numbers.
So in your professional opinion, the ballots were not sealed?
The ballots did not have an appropriate security seal on the boxes.
That's not on, so, okay, fine. My question was, were the ballots sealed?
They were closed with tape.
And where were they stored?
In the vault and in the tabulation center.
Now, would you say that your profession details are important?
Yes, they're highly important.
And you said that you reviewed the statutes prior to initiating this investigation?
I always have to do that because it's relevant, especially if a state states a statute.
So that's a yes.
Yes.
And you also reviewed federal statutes?
Yes.
AVA, I think you said?
I'll go as far as back as the 1990 FEC standards. I've reviewed them all, every version of the BBSG.
And you downloaded Title 16?
Yes. I like to have references for when they're referred to because they've been referred to in the Secretary of State's manual, they were referred to in the Maricopa manuals and procedures. So I like to actually read what's referred to ensure that it's accurate.
And when you read those documents, you pay close attention to detail because that's required by your profession. Is that correct?
I'm not a legal attorney, and so I read the laws for what they state and how they are.
And you testified that you reviewed some documents that were provided to the Lake campaign by a FOIA request. Is that accurate?
Objection, Your Honor. I don't believe he ever testified to that.
Well, it's cross-exam, so he can answer the question if he understands. If you don't understand the question, it's pretty.
No, these were public record requests that came from me from other technical professionals.
So they were not FOIA requests.
Those records were obtained via FOIA requests.
Are you familiar with FOIA? Can you tell me what FOIA stands for?
It's a Freedom of Information Act.
And is that statute a federal statute or a state statute?
That depends on what you're requesting the FOIA for. That's categorized at the federal level and state levels, to my knowledge.
So a FOIA can be either a state or a federal, in your understanding?
Yes.
And if federal was FOIA and state was a public records request under the Arizona statute, that would be a detail that doesn't interest you?
That, if the data was illegally obtained.
That's not the question. The question is the detail, difference between a federal statute and a state statute of interest to you?
When I provided evidence, I always asked the source of it. And I have received, in my experience, I have received evidence from law enforcement officials that, in my opinion, were not properly obtained. And as a forensic investigator who understands chain of custody and all the legal ramifications, because for the court's record, the majority of that deals with the statutes. For example, the lockpicks that I own as part of my security thing, in my state, I have to have a private investigator license. These are the statutes that a forensic investigator handling evidence has to be aware of.
Thank you. When you're working with your security thing, as you said it, are you familiar with federal statutes and state statutes?
Objection, Your Honor. Not sure about the question.
Well, if he's
What kind of
confused,
federal-
I'll withdraw the question, Your Honor.
Thank you. Next question.
You've just testified that you receive information from law enforcement that's both federal and state law enforcement. Is that correct?
I didn't say that. I said it was law enforcement, and
And you testified both federal law enforcement and state law enforcement. Is that correct?
what I just told you is I said I received it from law enforcement.
Well, when you receive information in your profession from law enforcement, are you familiar whether the law enforcement's federal or state?
Yes, when they provide me the evidence,
Is that a
yes.
detail that's important to you?
Yes.
I believe you testified that you examined some ballots that had been duplicated. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you testified that you examined the originals but not the duplicates. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And you testified that the duplicates were not kept next to the duplicate. The duplicates were not kept next to the originals. Is that correct?
That's correct. They're supposed to be traceable. You should easily identifiable. Mr. Garrett said that he would have to get his techs busy and that it would take them over a week to try to find them.
That's your recollection of what Mr. Jarrett said?
That is what Mr. Garrett said.
And if the ballots, the originals those and the duplicates were in the boxes right next to each other, would that surprise you?
The duplicates that that I was shown, because they were duplicated, were part of one of the vote centers and that he opened both those boxes. And two, because they couldn't identify some of the original duplicates, they had to run and count them so they could try to map them back to which side they belong to.
So that's your recollection of what Mr. Jarrett said when you asked to see the originals of the duplicates?
No,
I'm
they
asking
were-
you a detail. That's a detail that's important. You're telling this court that when you asked Mr. Jarrett to view the duplicates of the originals, that he told you would take 6 hours.
To clarify, I did not ask to see duplicates. They were part of the vote center, and they provided the entirety of what they have for the vote center. They could not provide what was originally
Thank you,
done.
Mr. Courier. I think the important point, and I want to ask you this to make sure that I understand it correctly, is that you did not ask to see the duplicates.
Objection, misstates his prior testimony argumentative.
This is cross, just for reference, and all cross. If he doesn't understand the question, he can have it phrased, but particularly with an expert witness, he's capable of answering. If you don't understand, you can have it rephrased. If you do understand, you can go ahead and answer. Would you like the question restated to you?
Yes, sir.
Please, Mr.
Mr. Perrick, is it your recollection that when you asked Mr. Jarrett to see the duplicates and the originals, that he told you it would take 6 hours to get them?
One, I did not ask to see them. They were
Well, that answers my
provided.
question then. Thank you, Mr. Perrick. That answers my question. You did not ask to see them.
Your Honor, if I may,
It's just, your counsel have to redirect,
yes,
so just answer his questions.
yes, sir. I just want to state the rule of
Well,
law.
but wait,
I have another question, Your Honor. It's appropriate.
please.
You've testified that you have a working theory that some of the ballots for the 2022 general election were on 20-inch paper, but were printed at 19 inches. Is that correct?
19-inch image printed on 20-inch paper. It is not a theory.
Okay, so it was 20-inch paper. The ballot was 20 inches, correct?
The paper was 20 inches.
And the image was 19 inches, according to your testimony, correct?
The ballot image was 19 inches, yes.
Are you familiar with a shrink-to-fit setting on a printer?
Yes, yes, I am.
Could a shrink-to-fit setting account for some of the ballots you observed being 19 inches on 20-inch paper?
That is a possibility, but it would violate the configuration settings they had for the voting systems and the tabulators.
And you've testified that you're familiar with the election process?
Yes, sir.
And you testified that if one were to take a 20-inch ballot that's shrunk to 19 inches and put it into a vote center precinct tabulator, it would not get tabulated.
It would not get tabulated at any tabulator.
Any tabulator. So,
That includes ICP or the ICCs at Central.
okay, so if it went down to Central, according to your understanding, and it was tried to run through the tower tabulators, it would also not be tabulated. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you just testified that you observed some duplicated ballots. Is it your understanding that a ballot that cannot be tabulated by a precinct-based tabulator and cannot be tabulated by a tower configured tabulator at Central would then be duplicated?
It would have to be because it couldn't be tabulated, so it would require duplication.
And after duplication, what would happen to that ballot?
The duplicated ballot, which is supposed to be marked with a specific ID, and that ID must be recorded on the original, and I saw those stickers on the originals.
Question is, what would happen to that ballot?
Then the ballot would be rerun through the duplicated ballot would be run through the tabulator.
So it would be tabulated. Is that your testimony?
The duplicated ballot would be tabulated. Yes, it should be.
Okay, so if a voter walked into a vote center on election day, filled out a ballot, maybe had a shrink to fit setting on it, so it wouldn't be counted on the tabletop, would go into door number 3, goes on down to McTech, they put it into the tower tabulator, and it doesn't get counted, and then it gets duplicated, and then it gets counted, so that voter's ballot was voted and tabulated. Is that your understanding?
But you started.
Is that your understanding?
Your Honor, I can't answer that question the way he asked the question because it's inaccurate.
So that means it's not your. I'm sorry.
I don't understand. You can say I don't understand, and you can rephrase it so you can understand. But if you don't like the way it's phrased, that's something that your counsel will have to clear up.
Yes, sir. Your Honor, if I can address the court. I'm provided for technical expertise and give those options. And if the technical scenario is inaccurate, I cannot answer the question.
Let me try again. Ms. Lake, right here in this room, bona fide candidate for governor of Grand Canyon State. Hundreds of thousands of voters would love to have had her as the next governor. One of them chooses not to vote in the 26 days of early voting, or mail-in voting, or emergency vote center voting, but chooses to show up on election day, gets a ballot from a ballot-on-demand printer, and somebody, either intentionally or inadvertently, has hit the shrink-to-fit setting, and this 20-inch ballot paper comes out 19 inches. This voter fills it out, Kari Lake, want her to be the next governor, throws it into the precinct tabulator. It comes out, goes into door number 3, goes down to McTech. The much more sensitive tabulators, according to you, it would not count it. It would then go to duplication. It would be duplicated. Then it would be tabulated. Is that your understanding of the elections in Maricopa County?
Your technical description is not possible.
So I apologize. I wasn't attempting to give a technical description. I was just saying what happens based on your testimony. So you're saying in that scenario, that voter who wanted to vote for Kari Lake would never have that vote tabulated. Is that your testimony?
My testimony is that a shrink-to-fit setting would rely at the application level, which would reside on the EMS, which Mr. Garrett just testified sends the print job to the printer. Therefore, it can't be accidental, as all the employees that man the EMS are trained.
Whether it's accidental or inadvertent.
I gave the two options, sir.
Please allow me to ask the question. I'll allow you to answer. Whether it's accidental or inadvertent, if the shrink-to-fit 19-inch ballot has to be duplicated, once it's duplicated, would it be tabulated? To your understanding.
There are two technical ways that image would be there. None of the ways you accept,
Sorry, Your
it's
Honor,
not even possible.
That's not
possible, Your Honor.
I understand what you're saying, Mr. Brady. That's not responsive to his question. If you are able to answer his question, you can do that.
Sir, are you able to answer the question?
I'm unable to answer your question.
Okay. Let me ask a different question. Are duplicated ballots tabulated? Maricopa County, general election 2022.
If they're duplicated correctly and they're configured correctly, yes, they should be.
Thank you. No further questions, Your Honor.
Okay. We're at the point where we need a break. We're going to take a 1 hour, not 1.5 hour recess. So we'll be back here at 1 o'clock to resume. So, back at 1 o'clock, break, and we'll resume where we left off.
Yes, sir. And now we'll realize I'm still in rows.
You read my mind. Thank you very much.
All rise.